You ever notice how some people only see a black man's worth after they learn how much money he has? The words would replay in Rachel Whitmore's head for years, but at 37,000 feet above Georgia, inside the warm gold glow of a luxury jet cabin, she still believed she could read a person's value the moment they stepped on board. The turbulence hit hard enough to rattle the crystal glasses before the seatbelt sign chimed on. A soft gasp rolled through the cabin as the private charter sliced through another pocket of rough air somewhere above Atlanta. Rachel steadied herself with one hand against the leather galley counter, jaw tight, posture perfect despite the shaking floor beneath her polished heels. She had worked executive flights for almost 9 years, long enough to recognize every type of wealthy passenger before they even spoke. Old money sat differently. Tech billionaires moved too fast. Athletes carried noise into a room. Politicians demanded attention without asking for it. But the man seated quietly into a didn't fit any category she respected. Elijah Kane sat near the window in a plain black hoodie beneath a charcoal overcoat, broad shoulders relaxed, one hand resting near a glass of untouched sparkling water. No expensive watch visible. No designer luggage placed beside him. No entourage. Just a tall black man traveling alone in first class on a jet reserved mostly for executives from Whitmore Air Charter's elite loyalty division. Rachel had noticed him immediately during boarding because people like him usually asked too many questions. But Elijah hadn't asked for anything. He thanked the ground crew when they loaded bags. He stepped aside to let an elderly couple enter first. He even smiled at the little girl seated across the aisle from him after she accidentally dropped her stuffed rabbit near his shoes. Quiet people unsettled Rachel more than difficult ones. Difficult passengers announced themselves. Quiet ones watched. Another violent shake rolled through the cabin. The overhead bins rattled sharply this time. A frightened cry escaped from somewhere behind the divider curtain. Rachel grabbed the silver service cart before it drifted sideways. Across the aisle. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated," she said smoothly, though irritation already crept beneath her professional tone. The little girl across from Elijah clutched her rabbit tighter against her chest. Maybe 6 years old. Tiny braids. Pink sneakers dangling inches above the floor. Her mother reached for her hand while trying to balance a paper cup sliding dangerously along the tray table. Then the plane dropped again. Hard. Gasps exploded across the cabin. One of the cart wheels lifted violently off the carpeted aisle. Rachel lost her grip for half a second. The fully loaded service cart jerked sideways, metal frame twisting directly toward the little girl's seat. Everything happened fast after that. Elijah stood instantly. No panic. No shouting. Just movement. One large hand caught the edge of the cart before it slammed forward. Glass bottles clinked sharply inside the cabinet doors. The force shoved Elijah against the aisle seat, but he kept the cart from tipping into the child. "Careful," he said calmly, tightening his grip against another burst of turbulence. But Rachel didn't see a man protecting a little girl. She saw a passenger grabbing company equipment. A black man standing over her in the middle of a chaotic cabin. Her pulse spiked instantly. "Sir, let go of the cart," she snapped. Elijah looked directly at her. His voice stayed low. "The wheel lock isn't secured." Another rough shake rattled the plane. The cart lurched again. Elijah tightened his grip before it could roll forward. The child whimpered softly. "Sir," Rachel repeated louder now, embarrassed that several passengers had begun staring. "Step back immediately." Elijah glanced toward the frightened girl first. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "someone's going to get hurt." The sentence should have ended everything. It should have slowed the moment down. But humiliation moves faster than reason inside people already full of judgment. Rachel's face burned hot. She heard whispers behind her. Felt eyes watching. A senior attendant losing control of her cabin in front of wealthy clients. And somehow, in her mind, the man standing there became the problem instead of the danger. She stepped forward quickly and struck his arm away from the cart with sharp force meant more to humiliate than harm. The cabin froze anyway. Not because of the contact itself. Because Elijah Kane never reacted. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't glare. Didn't threaten her. He simply released the cart slowly, then looked down toward the little girl to make sure she was safe before straightening his sleeve beneath the dim amber cabin lights. Outside the oval windows, thunderclouds rolled endlessly through the dark. The turbulence softened after another 15 minutes, But the atmosphere inside the cabin never fully settled. Fear had faded into silence, and silence had turned heavy. The kind that lingered after something embarrassing happened in public and nobody knew where to look afterward. Rachel Whitmore moved through the aisle with controlled professionalism, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her navy uniform jacket every few minutes, as if precision alone could erase what had happened. Her blonde hair remained pinned into a flawless twist beneath the soft cabin lighting, and her makeup still looked camera-ready, but there was tension now around her eyes that had not been there before takeoff. Across the cabin, Elijah Kane sat exactly where he had before, calm, one ankle resting over the opposite knee, a black cashmere coat folded neatly beside him. He had cleaned the small cut along his hand with a white cloth one of the passengers quietly offered him after the turbulence passed. Even the way he accepted help looked composed, graceful, like a man who had spent years learning how to survive humiliation without ever letting it touch his posture. The little girl across the aisle kept glancing toward him while holding her stuffed rabbit against her chest. Her mother finally leaned closer and whispered something softly into her ear. A moment later, the child carefully unbuckled her seatbelt and crossed the aisle on tiny pink sneakers. Rachel noticed immediately from the galley. "Sweetheart, sit back down please," she called automatically. But the girl ignored her. She stopped beside Elijah's seat instead, eyes wide with nervous courage. "Thank you for helping me," she said quietly. Elijah looked up from the tablet resting in his lap. For the first time since boarding, warmth softened his face completely. "You are very welcome," he replied. His voice carried the deep calm of someone impossible to provoke twice. The little girl studied the bandage around his hand. "Did it hurt?" she asked. Elijah glanced briefly at the cut before smiling faintly. "Not as much as it would have hurt if that cart hit you." The mother covered her mouth for a second, visibly emotional. Several nearby passengers lowered their eyes uncomfortably. Rachel felt heat creep into her neck again. She hated moments like this. Moments where sympathy shifted direction inside a room before anyone announced it aloud. She grabbed a tray of sparkling water glasses and stepped back into the aisle, posture sharp enough to cut glass. "Sir," she said carefully while stopping beside Elijah's seat. "Our crew would appreciate it if passengers avoided interfering with safety procedures during turbulence." The sentence sounded professional on the surface, but the edge underneath it was impossible to miss. Elijah slowly lifted his eyes toward her. Cabin lights reflected softly against his dark skin and the silver strands beginning to touch his temples. He looked expensive in a way no designer label could manufacture. Composed, educated, untouchable. "I understand," he answered. No anger, no sarcasm. Somehow that only frustrated Rachel more. Because men like him were supposed to react, defend themselves, raise their voice. Instead, Elijah Kane sat there with the same stillness as the thunderclouds drifting far below the wing outside his window. The pilot's voice crackled overhead moments later. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have begun our initial descent into New York. Local time is 8:42 p.m. Weather on the ground is clear with light winds." Soft movement returned to the cabin. Phones lit up. Laptop screens reopened. Luxury watches gleamed beneath the amber overhead lights. Rachel finally allowed herself one slow breath. 10 more minutes, and the flight would be over. 10 more minutes, and she would never have to see the quiet black passenger in seat 2A again. But, near the front galley, another attendant named Melissa suddenly frowned at the tablet manifest in her hands. "Rachel," she whispered carefully, "something is wrong with the passenger list." Rachel barely looked up while organizing glassware. "What now?" Melissa hesitated. "Seat 2A. Rachel's expression tightened instantly. "What about him?" Melissa swallowed once. "The ownership profile just updated after the Wi-Fi reconnected." Rachel finally looked over. Melissa's face had gone pale beneath the cabin lights. And for the first time that evening, uncertainty crept cold and sharp through Rachel Whitmore's chest. The private jet descended smoothly through layers of silver clouds as Manhattan slowly emerged below, like scattered gold beneath the night sky. Thousands of city lights shimmered against the dark Hudson River, stretching endlessly beyond the oval windows of the cabin. Inside, however, the atmosphere had shifted into something colder than the storm they had just escaped. Rachel Whitmore stared at the tablet in Melissa's trembling hands while the soft hum of the engines filled the silence around them. That cannot be right, Rachel whispered sharply. Melissa swallowed hard and angled the screen closer. The passenger profile for Seat 2A glowed beneath the airline database header in bold executive lettering. Elijah Kane, founder and chief executive officer of Kane Aviation Group, majority acquisition partner of Whitmore Air Charter, pending final transfer approval. Rachel felt her stomach tighten instantly. Her eyes flicked toward Elijah across the cabin. He still sat by the window with effortless composure, scrolling calmly through emails on his phone as if none of this concerned him at all. The city lights reflected softly against his sharp features, illuminating the clean line of his jaw and the quiet intelligence in his eyes. Rachel suddenly noticed details she had ignored before. The cut of his coat, the custom stitching along the collar, the understated elegance of the cufflinks resting against his wrist. Nothing loud, nothing flashy. Real wealth never needed attention. Her pulse quickened. Why was this not flagged before boarding? She asked. Melissa lowered her voice even further. Because he booked under a private review profile. Internal code only. Corporate oversight passengers sometimes travel anonymously before acquisitions. Rachel looked back toward Elijah again. Anonymous. The word echoed uncomfortably inside her chest. All evening she had treated him like a problem passenger when in reality, he had been quietly observing everything around him. Evaluating service. Watching the crew. Watching her. Near the aisle, the little girl had fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder with the stuffed rabbit tucked beneath her chin. The same child Elijah protected during the turbulence. Rachel suddenly remembered every second of the moment with brutal clarity. The force of the cart moving toward the girl. Elijah stepping in without hesitation. The calm warning in his voice. And her own reaction afterward. Heat crept slowly into her face. Maybe he did not recognize you, Melissa offered gently, trying to ease the panic forming behind Rachel's eyes. Maybe he just wanted privacy. But Rachel barely heard her. Because deep down she already understood something worse. Elijah Kane had recognized exactly who she was the entire flight. The aircraft wheels touched the runway moments later with a smooth, controlled landing. Soft applause scattered lightly through the cabin while Manhattan glittered outside beneath the cold December night. The pilot's voice returned overhead, warm and polished. Welcome to New York, ladies and gentlemen. Seatbelts clicked open across the cabin. Executives gathered briefcases. Expensive coats slid over tailored shoulders. Rachel forced herself into motion again, smoothing her uniform and preparing for arrival procedures with mechanical precision. She had built her entire career on perfection. Whitmore Air Charter did not hire ordinary attendants for executive international routes. Appearance mattered. Composure mattered. Every movement was designed to reassure powerful people that they belonged somewhere elevated above everyone else. Rachel had spent years mastering that illusion. But now, standing only 20 feet away from the man she publicly humiliated, she suddenly felt painfully small inside her perfectly tailored uniform. Elijah finally stood near the window seat, tall enough that several nearby passengers instinctively moved aside to let him pass. He slipped his phone into the pocket of his overcoat before reaching for the black leather carry-on beside him. The little girl looked up sleepily as he stepped into the aisle. Bye, airplane hero, she whispered with a tired smile. Elijah paused. A soft laugh escaped him for the first time all evening. Good night, sweetheart. Even Rachel noticed how instantly the tension in the cabin eased around him whenever he spoke. Not because he demanded authority, because he carried calm into spaces already full of ego. The cabin door finally opened with a pressurized hiss. Cold New York air drifted softly inside. Then Rachel saw them. 3 men in dark tailored coats moving quickly across the private terminal stairs below the aircraft. One carried a leather portfolio pressed tightly against his chest. Another spoke urgently into an earpiece while scanning the jet windows above. Melissa looked toward Rachel with visible alarm. Those are Kane Aviation executives. Rachel's throat tightened. Because all 3 men were not walking toward the captain. They were walking toward Elijah Kane. The private terminal outside the aircraft glowed beneath rows of polished white floodlights, reflecting softly against the rain-darkened tarmac like liquid silver. Beyond the massive glass walls of the executive hangar, black luxury SUVs waited silently in a perfect line while airport personnel moved with sudden nervous energy across the runway. Rachel Whitmore stood frozen near the front galley as the three men in tailored overcoats climbed the boarding stairs with urgent precision. Their expensive leather shoes struck the aluminum steps sharply, each sound echoing through the quiet cabin like a countdown she could somehow feel in her chest. Elijah Kane remained calm. One hand rested loosely around the handle of his carry-on while the other adjusted the cuff beneath his coat sleeve where the small bandage still wrapped his hand. The cut had stained faintly through the white fabric now, a thin trace of red against elegance and restraint. He looked less like a billionaire and more like a man exhausted from carrying responsibility too long. Yet the moment the executive stepped inside the cabin, the entire atmosphere changed around him instantly. "Mr. Kane," the first man said immediately, his tone respectful enough to silence the remaining whispers among passengers gathering their belongings nearby. "The acquisition transfer cleared 20 minutes ago. Kane Aviation officially controls 51% of Whitmore Air Charter effective tonight." Rachel felt the blood drain slowly from her face. 51%. Control. Ownership. Words she had only heard during executive training seminars suddenly felt terrifyingly personal. Elijah accepted the leather portfolio handed to him without any visible excitement. He simply nodded once and signed the final page with a black fountain pen pulled from his coat pocket. Smooth. Deliberate. The kind of signature practiced by someone used to decisions worth billions. Around him, executives stood straighter. Ground crew lowered their eyes respectfully. Even the pilot waiting near the cockpit door seemed tense now. Rachel had spent years serving wealthy passengers, but this was different. Money usually announced itself loudly. Elijah Kane carried power the way some men carried silence. Effortlessly, one of the executives noticed the bandage around Elijah's hand and frowned immediately. "Sir, are you injured?" The question cut through the cabin sharply. Elijah glanced briefly toward the wrapped cut before answering. "Nothing serious." But another voice interrupted softly from nearby. "He got hurt helping my daughter." The little girl's mother stepped forward near the aisle, still holding the sleepy child against her shoulder. Her expression hardened slightly as she looked toward Rachel before returning to Elijah. If he had not stopped that cart, her voice trailed off emotionally. She did not need to finish the sentence. The silence afterward said enough. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably. Melissa lowered her eyes toward the floor. Rachel suddenly became aware of every detail around her at once. The cold air drifting through. The open cabin door. The polished gold buttons on her uniform sleeves. The faint smell of expensive cologne and jet fuel mixing together beneath the cabin lights. And Elijah standing only a few feet away, calm despite every reason not to be. One of the executives turned toward Rachel then, confusion settling across his face. "There was an onboard incident?" Rachel opened her mouth instantly. "Sir, I can explain." But Elijah finally spoke before she could continue. "No need." The entire cabin went still again. Rachel looked toward him in disbelief. Elijah closed the portfolio slowly before handing it back to his legal advisor. "The child is safe. That is what matters." His voice remained deep and controlled, but there was something colder underneath now. Not anger. Distance. The kind created the moment respect disappears from a room forever. Rachel swallowed hard. "Mr. Kane," she began carefully, "I did not realize." Elijah looked directly at her for the first time since landing. The city lights outside reflected softly in his dark eyes, steady and unreadable. "That I own the company?" he asked quietly. Rachel's breath caught. No one moved. No one even pretended not to listen anymore. Elijah studied her face for one long silent second before continuing. "You knew exactly who you thought I was." The sentence landed harder than shouting ever could. Rachel felt her throat tighten instantly because deep down she understood he was right. Before she saw status, before she saw wealth, before she saw ownership, she had only seen a black man standing in a place she unconsciously believed belonged to someone else. The cold December wind swept through the open cabin door as passengers slowly exited into the glowing private terminal below, but Rachel Whitmore could barely feel it anymore. Her hands remained perfectly folded in front of her the way executive flight training demanded, yet beneath the polished surface of her composure, panic spread quietly through her chest like ice water. Elijah Kane stood only a few feet away, surrounded by executives in tailored coats and airport personnel, suddenly eager to please him. The contrast made the entire evening feel unreal. Less than an hour ago, she had looked at him and seen inconvenience. Now every person around her looked at him like gravity itself shifted when he entered a room. One of the executives beside Elijah glanced toward Rachel again, visibly unsettled. "Sir, should we contact corporate human resources tonight?" he asked carefully. The question hung heavily in the air. Rachel's stomach tightened instantly. Melissa looked away. Even the pilot standing near the cockpit lowered his eyes toward the floor. Elijah remained silent for several seconds while adjusting the cuff of his dark overcoat. Beyond the terminal glass, snow had begun falling lightly over the runway, soft white flakes drifting through the glow of blue taxiway lights. The entire airport looked quiet and expensive, wrapped in midnight silver and gold. Elijah finally turned toward the little girl, still resting sleepily against her mother's shoulder. "Did you enjoy your flight?" he asked gently. The child nodded with a tired smile. "I was scared at first." Elijah's expression softened. "Most people are during turbulence. But you were not," she whispered. Elijah looked out briefly toward the snowy runway before answering. "Sometimes staying calm is the only thing keeping other people calm too." Rachel felt those words settle painfully inside her chest because she suddenly understood what made the moment unbearable. It was not the ownership papers. It was not the executives waiting for him downstairs. It was the simple truth that Elijah Kane had behaved with more grace under humiliation than anyone else on the aircraft. The little girl's mother stepped closer before leaving the cabin. "Thank you again, Mr. Kane." Her eyes flickered briefly toward Rachel. Some people only see danger where they should see dignity. Then she disappeared into the terminal crowd, carrying her daughter through the falling snow. Silence followed again. Heavy, sharp. Rachel opened her mouth carefully. "Mr. Kane, I truly apologize for what happened." Elijah looked at her calmly. "Do you?" The question was quiet enough that nobody could mistake it for cruelty. Somehow that made it worse. Rachel swallowed hard. "I misjudged the situation." Elijah studied her face for a long moment. "No," he replied softly. "You misjudged me." The words stripped away every safe excuse she had been reaching for since landing. Rachel felt heat burn beneath her skin because deep down she knew he was right. If Elijah had boarded the jet wearing a designer suit with 3 assistants behind him, she would have smiled differently, spoken differently, listened differently, and both of them knew it. One of the executives shifted awkwardly nearby. "Sir, the board is waiting for your statement regarding tonight's transition." Elijah nodded once, but kept his eyes on Rachel. "You know what the saddest part is?" he asked quietly. Rachel could not answer. Elijah glanced toward the dark window where the reflection of the cabin lights shimmered faintly against the glass. "I have spent 20 years building companies worth billions of dollars. Yet the moment things became stressful up there." He looked back at her gently, almost tired now. "You still saw me as someone who did not belong." Rachel's eyes lowered instantly. The truth inside his voice carried no anger anymore, only disappointment. That hurt more than shouting ever could. Elijah picked up his carry-on slowly and stepped toward the cabin exit. The executives immediately moved aside to clear his path. But before leaving, he paused beside Rachel one final time. Snow drifted softly beyond the terminal glass behind him, while airport lights reflected silver against the sharp lines of his coat. "I am not going to destroy your life, Ms. Whitmore," he said calmly. Rachel looked up in surprise. Elijah's expression remained unreadable. People reveal enough about themselves eventually. Most of the damage comes from that. Then he walked down the aircraft stairs into the winter night, while every executive in the terminal followed behind him without hesitation. Rachel stood alone inside the silent cabin, staring at the faint red stain still visible through the white bandage he left behind on the armrest beside seat 2A. Snow continued drifting quietly across the executive terminal long after Elijah Kane's convoy disappeared into the Manhattan night. Inside the aircraft cabin, the silence left behind felt strangely louder than the turbulence had earlier. Rachel Whitmore remained standing beside seat 2A while ground crew members moved carefully through the aisle collecting glasses and folded blankets. Nobody spoke much anymore. The energy inside the cabin had changed from luxury confidence into something restrained and uncomfortable, as if everyone suddenly understood they had witnessed more than a simple misunderstanding. Rachel slowly reached down and picked up the white bandage Elijah had left resting against the armrest. The faint stain across the fabric had darkened slightly now beneath the cabin lights. For some reason, seeing that small trace of blood unsettled her more than the ownership papers had, because it reminded her of the one detail she kept trying to avoid. Elijah had been hurt protecting someone else, and she had punished him for it. Melissa approached quietly from behind, holding a tablet against her chest. "Corporate is already calling," she whispered carefully. Rachel closed her eyes for one brief second. "How bad?" Melissa hesitated. "Very." Outside the cabin windows, airport vehicles moved slowly beneath spinning amber lights, while snow collected softly along the edge of the runway. New York looked cold and beautiful in the distance, skyscrapers glowing like gold bars against the dark winter sky. Normally, Rachel loved this part of executive travel. The elegance, the exclusivity, the feeling that she belonged inside a world most people would never even touch. But tonight the luxury around her suddenly felt hollow. She walked slowly through the empty cabin, heels soft against the carpeted aisle, replaying every second of the flight in her mind. Elijah thanking the ground crew. Elijah calming the frightened child. Elijah staying composed after being humiliated in front of an entire cabin full of wealthy strangers. The more she remembered, the worse she felt. Near the galley mirror, Rachel caught sight of her own reflection beneath the dim amber lighting. Perfect hair, perfect uniform, diamond earrings catching the light near her jawline. She looked exactly like the woman she had trained herself to become over the years. Controlled, sophisticated, untouchable. Yet all she could hear now was Elijah's voice asking quietly, "Do you?" when she apologized. The question had not sounded cruel. It sounded disappointed. That was what stayed with her. Disappointment from a man who expected better from people. Melissa finally broke the silence again. "You know he could have fired you right there." Rachel stared out toward the falling snow. "I know, but he did not." Rachel lowered her eyes toward the bandage still resting in her hand. "That almost makes it worse." A soft chime echoed from the galley tablet. Melissa checked the screen and inhaled sharply. Rachel looked over slowly. "The footage." "What footage?" Melissa turned the tablet toward her. Security recordings from the cabin cameras had already uploaded into the internal corporate review system. The paused image on screen showed the exact moment the service cart tilted dangerously toward the little girl during turbulence. Elijah's hand reaching out. The child frozen in fear. Rachel felt her chest tighten instantly because the truth looked even clearer from this angle. There was no aggression in Elijah's movement. No threat. Only instinctive protection. Melissa lowered the tablet carefully. "Everyone at corporate is watching this right now." Rachel sat down slowly in the same leather seat Elijah occupied only minutes earlier. The cabin still carried the faint scent of cedar cologne and winter air from his coat. Beyond the oval window beside her, snowflakes drifted endlessly through the glow of runway lights like silent pieces of ash. "Why did he not destroy me?" she whispered quietly. Melissa looked toward the dark runway for a moment before answering. "Maybe because men who have been judged their entire lives learn the difference between justice and revenge." Rachel swallowed hard. For the first time that night, tears threatened the edges of her carefully controlled expression. Not because she feared losing her career, but because she finally understood something far more painful. Elijah Kane had walked onto that jet carrying power, wealth, intelligence, and dignity. Yet none of those things protected him from being reduced to a stereotype the moment someone stopped seeing his humanity first. By midnight, the snowstorm had thickened over Manhattan, wrapping the city in a cold white haze that softened even the sharpest skyscrapers beyond the glass walls of Whitmore Air Charter headquarters. Inside the executive conference floor on Lexington Avenue, however, nothing felt soft anymore. Rachel Whitmore sat alone at the far end of a polished walnut table while corporate executives reviewed the cabin footage for the third time in complete silence. The giant screen reflected blue light across expensive suits, crystal water glasses, and tense expressions that grew more uncomfortable with every replay. Rachel kept her hands folded tightly in her lap beneath the table to hide the slight trembling in her fingers. On screen, the turbulence shook the cabin violently. The service cart lurched toward the child. Elijah Kane stood instantly, without hesitation. Then came the moment Rachel wished she could erase from existence. Her own face. Her own reaction. Sharp. Defensive. Certain. The room remained silent after the footage ended. Nobody rushed to defend her. Nobody softened what happened with polite corporate language anymore. Because now the truth was visible from every angle. One of the board members finally leaned back in his chair with a tired exhale. He saved that little girl. Rachel lowered her eyes toward the table. I know. Another executive closed the report folder slowly. Do you understand how catastrophic this could have become for the company? Rachel nodded faintly. Yes, sir. But deep down she understood something worse than the corporate damage. The footage had forced her to confront herself without excuses. For years she believed prejudice looked loud and obvious. Cruel words. Angry people. Open hatred. But hers had looked polished. Educated. Professional. It hid itself behind assumptions she never questioned because nobody around her ever challenged them. Until Elijah Kane did. The conference room doors suddenly opened. Every executive straightened immediately. Elijah walked inside wearing a charcoal wool coat over a dark turtleneck, snowflakes still melting lightly against his shoulders from outside. He looked calm despite the late hour, carrying the same quiet gravity that seemed to change every room the moment he entered it. Rachel's breath caught slightly when she saw him again. Not because he was wealthy, not because he owned the company now, but because he still carried dignity after everything that happened. One of the board members stood quickly. Mr. Kane, we were just discussing disciplinary action. Elijah removed his leather glove slowly before taking a seat near the center of the table. I assumed you would be. His voice remained low and controlled. Rachel could barely meet his eyes. Outside the massive windows behind him, Manhattan shimmered beneath falling snow like scattered diamonds against black velvet. The entire city looked beautiful from up there. Distant. Quiet. Elijah glanced briefly toward the paused footage still frozen on the screen behind Rachel. The image showed him holding the service card in place while the frightened child stared up at him. Have all of you finished reviewing the incident? He asked. Several executives nodded carefully. Yes, sir. Elijah folded his hands together calmly. Good. Silence settled again. Then one board member cleared his throat awkwardly. Mr. Kane, given the seriousness of the situation, termination would be understandable. Rachel's stomach tightened instantly, but Elijah did not answer right away. Instead, he looked toward the snowy skyline beyond the glass walls for several long seconds. You know, he said quietly, when I was 16, my mother cleaned office buildings in Chicago. The room went completely still. Rachel slowly looked up. Elijah's reflection shimmered faintly in the dark windows behind him as he continued speaking. One night after her shift, a security guard stopped her in the lobby because he thought she stole a necklace from one of the executives upstairs. His expression remained calm, but there was old sadness beneath it now. She stood there in her janitor uniform while strangers searched her bag in front of everyone walking through that building. Nobody moved. Elijah lowered his eyes briefly toward the table. They found nothing. The silence afterward felt almost sacred. Rachel's throat tightened painfully because she suddenly understood this was not just about one flight, not just one misunderstanding. Elijah had spent his entire life being asked to prove he belonged in rooms people automatically gave to others. He finally looked directly at Rachel again. The problem with prejudice, he said softly, is that the people carrying it usually think they are good people. Rachel felt tears burn behind her eyes for the first time all night because she realized he was not trying to humiliate her. He was trying to make her see. The conference room remained silent long after Elijah Kane finished speaking. Snow drifted steadily beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, while Manhattan glowed beneath the storm like a city holding its breath. Rachel Whitmore sat motionless at the far end of the table, her hands folded tightly together as if composure alone could hold her emotions in place. But the carefully polished confidence she carried for years had cracked open quietly tonight, and there was no hiding from what stood exposed underneath it anymore. Elijah leaned back slightly in his chair, dark eyes calm beneath the soft gold lighting overhead. He did not look angry. That was what made everything harder for Rachel to process. She had prepared herself for rage, for humiliation, for revenge delivered by a billionaire with enough power to erase her career overnight. Instead, Elijah spoke with the patience of someone who understood pain too well to casually hand it to someone else. One of the executives finally cleared his throat carefully. Mr. Kane, the board still requires a decision regarding Ms. Whitmore's employment status. Rachel felt every pair of eyes shift toward Elijah again. The city lights reflected against the polished conference table between them, shimmering softly beside untouched glasses of water and stacks of acquisition documents. Elijah remained quiet for a moment before answering. What exactly would firing her fix? Several executives exchanged uncertain looks. Nobody answered immediately. Elijah glanced once toward the paused cabin footage still visible on the large screen behind. Rachel, would it teach empathy? He asked calmly. Would it erase the assumptions that caused this? The room stayed silent. Elijah folded his gloves carefully beside the leather portfolio near his seat. People like to believe prejudice belongs only to monsters, he continued softly. But most of the time it survives inside ordinary moments. Small reactions, quick judgments, fear disguised as professionalism. Rachel lowered her eyes toward the table as tears finally gathered despite every effort to stop them. Because every word felt painfully true. She had not hated Elijah. She had not even consciously thought of herself as racist. Yet the moment stress entered the cabin, she instinctively treated him like a threat instead of a passenger trying to help. And the truth of that realization felt unbearable. Mr. Kane, Rachel whispered quietly, voice trembling for the first time all night. I am ashamed of what I did. Elijah looked at her steadily. Rachel forced herself to continue. Not because you own the company. Not because people saw it. She swallowed hard. Because when I replay that moment in my head now, I cannot recognize the person I became. The conference room stayed perfectly still around them. Snow tapped softly against the glass windows high above Lexington Avenue, while distant sirens echoed faintly through the city below. Elijah studied Rachel's face for several long seconds. The expensive conference room, the executives, the acquisition paperwork surrounding them suddenly seemed unimportant compared to the honesty sitting quietly in the room now. Finally, Elijah nodded once. That is the first honest thing you have said tonight. Rachel closed her eyes briefly as tears slipped free despite herself. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just human. One of the board members shifted awkwardly. Sir, are you recommending disciplinary probation? Elijah leaned back slowly in his chair. I am recommending education. Confusion crossed several faces around the table. Elijah continued calmly. Starting next quarter, every executive employee at Whitmore Air Charter will complete bias and de-escalation training. He glanced toward Rachel again, including management. The room remained stunned. One executive blinked. Sir, you are keeping her employed? Elijah's expression stayed composed. I could destroy her career tonight. His voice remained low and steady. But if humiliation alone changed people, the world would already be better than it is. Rachel looked at him in disbelief. Elijah stood slowly from his chair and gathered his gloves. What matters now is whether she learns from this moment or spends the rest of her life pretending it was only a misunderstanding. He buttoned his charcoal coat calmly while snow continued falling outside behind him in endless silver streaks. Then for the first time all evening, Rachel finally understood the real difference between power and character. Power was having the ability to ruin someone. Character was choosing not to. 3 weeks later, the first heavy snowfall of January covered Manhattan in quiet white layers that softened the noise of the city beneath it. Inside the newly renovated executive lounge at Whitmore Air Charter headquarters, warm amber lights reflected against polished marble floors while the low sound of piano music drifted through the glass atrium. Employees moved calmly through the building in dark tailored uniforms, carrying tablets and coffee trays beneath the elegant winter decorations now hanging from the ceiling. But something inside the company had changed since the night Elijah Kane took control. The atmosphere felt different. Less performative. Less cold. Rachel Whitmore noticed it immediately every morning she walked through the lobby. People looked at one another longer now. Spoke more carefully. Listened more. The mandatory training sessions Elijah introduced had started quietly, but the conversations spreading through the company afterward reached far beyond policy manuals or executive presentations. For the first time in years, employees were talking honestly about bias instead of pretending it belonged only to other people. Rachel stood near the lounge windows overlooking Park Avenue, adjusting the sleeve of her redesigned navy uniform while snow drifted softly outside beyond the glass. She looked different now somehow. Not less elegant, just less guarded. The sharp perfection she once wore like armor had softened into something more human. On the silver pin attached beside her collar was a new title, Senior Passenger Relations Director. The promotion surprised almost everyone inside the company when it was announced, especially her. At first, Rachel thought Elijah was rewarding her out of pity, but she eventually understood the truth during their final meeting 2 weeks earlier. I am not promoting you because of what happened, Elijah told her calmly from behind the enormous windows of his office overlooking the Hudson River. I am promoting you because people who truly confront their own failures often become the safest people to lead others. Those words stayed with her every day since. Near the lounge entrance, Melissa approached holding a digital tablet and smiled softly. The Chicago flight just landed. Rachel nodded once. Thank you. Across the atrium below, executives and passengers moved through the terminal beneath shimmering gold lights, while snow pressed gently against the enormous windows surrounding the building. Then Rachel saw him. Elijah Kane stepped through the private entrance wearing a charcoal overcoat over a black cashmere scarf, one hand tucked casually into his pocket, while assistants walked several steps behind him discussing schedules. Yet despite the wealth surrounding him now, he still carried himself with the same calm stillness he had inside the cabin that night. Rachel watched several employees greet him warmly as he crossed the lobby. Maintenance workers, reception staff, security officers. Elijah stopped for every single person. Learned names, asked questions, looked people in the eye when they answered. The same dignity he wanted from the world, he quietly gave to others first. As he passed beneath the chandelier lights near the lounge entrance, Elijah noticed Rachel standing nearby. He slowed slightly. Snowflakes melted softly against the shoulders of his coat, while city lights shimmered behind him through the towering glass walls. Good evening, Ms. Whitmore. Rachel smiled gently. Good evening, Mr. Kane. For one brief second, neither spoke further. But the silence between them no longer felt heavy, only honest. Rachel glanced toward the runway outside, where planes moved slowly through the falling snow beneath blue taxiway lights. I keep thinking about something you said, she admitted quietly. Elijah adjusted the cuff of his glove. Which part? Rachel looked down briefly before meeting his eyes again. That prejudice survives in ordinary moments. Elijah remained still. Rachel exhaled softly. I think what scares me most now is realizing how easy it is to become someone you never believed you could be. Elijah studied her face for a moment before answering. The important thing is whether you stay that person. Rachel nodded slowly. Somewhere below them in the terminal, laughter echoed faintly beside the sound of rolling suitcases across polished stone floors. Life moving forward. Elijah glanced once toward the snowy skyline beyond the windows. My mother used to say character is revealed most clearly in moments where nobody forces kindness out of you. Rachel smiled faintly. She sounds wise. Elijah's expression softened almost invisibly. She cleaned office buildings her whole life. People underestimated her every day. He looked back toward the glowing city outside. That is how I learned dignity has nothing to do with status. For a moment, they both stood quietly beside the glass while snow drifted endlessly through the New York night beyond them. Then Elijah adjusted his coat and continued toward the elevators with his team following behind him. Rachel remained near the window watching his reflection disappear into the golden light of the executive corridor. And somewhere deep inside the silence left behind, she finally understood that the most powerful people in the world were not the ones capable of destroying others. They were the ones strong enough not to.